Welcome. In this video, we're going to cover our Chapter 12. In this video, we're going to start the process of installing Windows. Um, our objectives for this chapter are to be able to plan a Windows installation focused on Windows 10, installing Windows 10 in a virtual environment, and configuring many Windows settings after their installations. And finally, we'll cover certain aspects to be aware of when installing Windows within a larger organization. There are several reasons why one would be required to install Windows. You're adding a new system, you're installing a new hard drive, your existing system is corrupt or damaged, you are upgrading your system. But before you install, there are many options and decisions that you need to make. Many of these decisions apply to any installation of an operating system, but we'll cover these in detail as we go along. Since Windows is not a free operating system, there are different licensing options available. One of these is the OEM license. With this version, you can choose this if you're building systems for resale. This means it means that you are not using the systems for yourself, but you are selling them to a person or company that will then be using the system. The OEM version is cheaper than the retail version because for several reasons. One, you're usually buying in bulk, plus as a reseller, since you're reselling the systems, Microsoft gives you a steep discount, so that it helps you be able to sell the systems at a competitive price. But if you're not reselling the system, you cannot purchase and use the cheaper OEM licenses. There are some restrictions to OEM licenses. OEM license, besides that you have to install on a system that you're reselling, but OEM licenses can only be installed on new computers for resale, and you are allowed to upgrade certain hardware components, but you cannot upgrade the motherboard. If you change out the motherboard for a new version of motherboard or a different version of motherboard, you have to purchase another license, right? So if you change the motherboards at all, you must purchase a new OEM license. If you plan to use the system, then you need and must purchase a retail version of Windows. And then with that version, though, you don't have the limitations. You can upgrade hardware, you own that license, and you can transfer it from machine to machine, but one machine. You can't have the license on multiple machines, the retail version. For the most part, nowadays, you'll only be dealing with 64-bit architectures. However, just know that if you have a 32-bit CPU, you can only run a 32-bit version of Windows on that system. 64 bits allow you to use more RAM, but they also require more RAM to install the software. However, the requirements are pretty minimal in today's standards. And 64-bit applications and architecture will run faster than a 32-bit architecture and software. Not only does Windows have many different versions, within each versions there are different editions and licensing. So you can see here broken down, they have different versions, like Windows 10 or Windows 8, right, and Windows 7. But within each version, then you have different editions such as Home, Pro, and Enterprise. Most organizations will use Professional or Enterprise editions, whereas most home users will use the Home edition. Each edition will have different features and functions that can be utilized. For example, Professional and Enterprise editions can join a domain and utilize advanced centralized management features, whereas the Home Edition does not have any access to these features. Enterprise Edition provides all the advanced features, where Professional provides most of the advanced features. And so there's a cost difference between different editions. There are also certain hardware requirements in order to install Windows, which will be discussed on the next slide. But first we'll discuss hardware drive partitioning. There are two methods to partition a hard drive: the old way, which is a master boot record, MBR, and the new way, the GUID partition table, or GPT. Most systems now will utilize GPT as the MBR, or master boot record, cannot recognize drives larger than 2.2 terabytes. Typically, on retail computers, Windows is installed on the only hard drive within the computer and is allocated all the space available on the hard drive within a single partition. That's technically not true. It is the bulk of it. There may be a recovery partition that the vendor will also put on there. Sometimes it's hidden. And then there's a system partition that Windows puts in as well, or a little hidden partition as well. But technically, I mean, these are like megs, of space. They're not usually very large. So typically, it's a single partition. And organizations will usually do the same unless there's a reason, right? And there are reasons in many instances where an organization or even a home user would want to install multiple hard drives and or multiple partitions where the hard drive space is split between different options or different partitions. Some of these could be for video rendering or some things like that, where you can get the speed of the drive, of a second drive for video rendering, things like that. Those are reasons why you might have multiple hard drives. And also with dealing with videos or very large files, right? You may want a second hard drive just because it's cheaper to buy, say buy two 4 terabyte drives instead of one 8 terabyte drive. And Windows itself doesn't need a lot of space, but you might need more space for your videos and files and things like that. So maybe you buy a 2 terabyte drive for Windows, and then you buy an 8 terabyte drive for your videos or something like that. So that there may be reasons and instances where you have multiple drives in a system. But typically, it's probably good practice to allocate Windows as much space on the drive as possible. Splitting up the drive that Windows is on can run into issues with space, even on larger drives. I would recommend doing multiple hard drives when possible versus splitting up the drive that Windows is on and allocating all the drive space to Windows. It just makes it a little easier if you have users that use a lot of disk space with your documents and things like that, where they're located. Windows is typically installed on the C drive. However, during the installation, you can change this to any drive letter, A through Z, although this is not really recommended, as this may confuse support personnel and users, since it's typically found on the C drive and defaults to install on the C drive. On this slide here just shows the minimum hardware requirements for installing Windows. It's very low. 1 gigahertz or faster CPU, must support the NX PAE and the SEE two processor functions. You're normally going to be dealing with 64-bit Windows, so 2 gigabits of RAM or more, preferably more. And free hard disk space, you need at least 20 gigs to install the 64-bit version, and then you need some form of DirectX 9 with WDDM 1.0 or higher driver for video. The Unified Extensible Firmware Interface, or UEFI, is just software that's installed on a chip that's located on your motherboard. And the UEFI, it's responsible for managing your key hardware devices, such as your keyboard, monitor, and hard drive during the startup process before the OS or operating system gets loaded. The UEFI replaced the basic input-output system, or BIOS. And you may hear me call it BIOS since I've called it BIOS for so many years. But today, the UEFI is what is found on the motherboard. It replaced the BIOS software. And it's just a software that starts up your machine. When you hit that power button, that's what starts up. It's the software on the chip on the motherboard that gets all the hardware running and locates the operating system to load. So yeah, the UEFI is responsible for running your hardware devices before the operating system is loaded. The UEFI finds the boot device, the hard drive or whatever, USB or whatever contains the operating system, and hands off the startup process to the operating system. You can use the UEFI to change the date and time, select the order of boot devices such as USB or the hard disk drive or a DVD if you have it still, or a network boot, right? So you can boot off the network. There's various options of where the system can find its operating system, and you control the order that it looks at to find the operating system, and you do that in the UEFI. And then also you can enable or disable devices such as if you had a DVD device or something like that, you can enable and disable functions. Virtualization is one that you'll see and we'll run into. Sometimes the motherboard is capable of virtualization, but it is turned off by default in the UEFI, and you need to enable it in order to be able to run any virtual machines. If you have hard drives larger than 2.2 terabyte, or you want to use the GPT partition, you must use the UEFI firmware. You can't use the BIOS firmware or even the legacy UEFI, the CSM. You must use the full functioning UEFI firmware if your hard drive is larger than 2.2 terabytes, or if you're using the GUID partition table, GPT. UEFI and GPT will only work on 64-bit systems. They will not work on 32-bit systems, but frankly, you probably rarely run into a 32-bit system anymore. UEFI has a secure boot option that can help protect and prevent malware from hijacking a system during startup. And there is a legacy mode for UEFI. It's called CSM that you can use if you are installing on a 32-bit version of architecture and a 32-bit version of Windows, and or wanting to use the MBR partition. Once again, you'd be on 32-bit. Then you could go into legacy mode. But frankly, there's very rare reasons that you would ever need to do that anymore. Device drivers are software that are used to run hardware devices. You must use the appropriate version of a driver for each version of Windows, right? So 32-bit device drivers are needed on 32-bit Windows, and 64-bit device drivers are needed on 64-bit versions of Windows. And once again, today you should be rare that you run into any 32-bit versions, so you should be looking for a 64-bit device driver versions more often than not. If you're not sure about your hardware or software about running on the version of Windows you're looking at installing, you can do what's called a dual boot or multi-boot system. And this is where you install another operating system to a different partition or hard drive, and then you can select which operating system boots up on the device. So you could have like Windows 8 and Windows 10 on the same computer. They're just installed on different hard drives or installed on different partitions. And then, as I said, in the UEFI, in the boot process, you can determine which one boots, right? And then thus, by having a dual boot system, you can then check out if the software or hardware runs as expected, and then you can delete the other partition if it's running fine. Say you were wanting to know if it ran on Windows 10, you already had Windows 8, you install Windows 10, you check out the software, everything looks fine, or you check out your hardware, everything's running fine, then you can delete the Windows 8 system, or you can keep it, but it's up to you. Many people do run dual boots all the time, and they may run different versions of operating systems. And back in the day, we used to do it so we could provide better support, because you could then have a system that was running the same OS as the person that would be calling in with the problem. So you might have 2 or 3 different versions of an operating system because there may be 2 or 3 different versions installed throughout the organization. And so then you would boot in to whichever one the caller was on, just so that you could see what they see, right? Because it could be different. Like years ago, I had a laptop which I could swap out hard drives, so I could do that very thing. One hard drive had Windows 95, and the other had the OS2. OS2 is an old operating system developed by IBM. That was around the time of 1995 when Windows 95 came out. But I could swap out these drives depending on who was calling in. I had another Windows machine that I could run, but I had a laptop for support purposes, so that I would put in the hard drive that the caller was calling off of, and being able to see what they saw and be able to walk them through procedures. So it just made life a little easier. Today, we use virtual machines as it's simply easier to run multiple virtual computers, each with their own operating system within your computer. And we'll be doing this in this class. You'll even create a dual boot virtual machine, and we'll install Windows and Linux on several virtual machines, give you hands-on access to installing software and managing the OS. And this is just simply an example of a video card that comes with its own device drivers on a CD. However, today many systems do not have a DVD or CD to where you could install this from, so you would just go out to the manufacturer's website and download the device drivers to install the video card. And that's it for this video. I'll see you later in the continuation for Chapter 12.